Dawn breaks over the ancient castle town of Kumamoto. The year is 1877, and the morning silence is shattered by the clash of steel against steel. But this is no ordinary battle. This is the last desperate stand of the samurai, Japan's legendary warrior class. 37 men, armed with nothing but their ancestral swords, are about to challenge an entire government army equipped with modern rifles and artillery. This isn't just a rebellion, this is Japan's own Alamo. Picture this: the world's most advanced warrior class, who had ruled Japan for over 700 years, now facing extinction. Not by foreign invasion or plague, but by their own government's march toward modernization. These 37 samurai weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their entire way of life. The story begins 10 years earlier, in 1868, when Japan underwent the most dramatic transformation in its history. The Meiji Restoration had begun, and Emperor Meiji's government was determined to transform Japan from a feudal society into a modern industrial power. Their rallying cry? Enrich the country, strengthen the military. But for Japan's proud samurai class, this meant the end of everything they held dear. Imagine being told that your family's centuries-old profession, your identity, your very way of life was now obsolete. The government banned the wearing of swords, the very symbol of samurai status. Traditional topknots were outlawed. Even the samurai's guaranteed stipends, which had supported their families for generations, were stripped away. It was as if someone had suddenly declared that all U.S. military personnel were no longer needed and their way of life was to be erased overnight. But our story focuses on one particular group of samurai, led by a man named Katsura Kogoro. These warriors had already tasted the bitter pill of defeat during the Satsuma Rebellion, where the legendary Saigo Takamori, the last true samurai, had made his final stand. But for these 37 men, that defeat wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. These weren't just any samurai. They were the elite of the elite, master swordsmen who had spent their entire lives perfecting their craft. Many had served as instructors in prestigious martial arts schools. Others had fought in the bloody battles that brought about the Meiji Restoration. They had seen both the old world and the new, and they had made their choice. Their leader, Katsura, was a complex figure. A master swordsman who had studied Western military tactics, he understood better than most what his men were up against. He had witnessed firsthand the devastating power of modern weapons during the Satsuma Rebellion. Yet he chose to fight anyway. Why? Because for him and his men, this wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about honor, about dying on their feet rather than living on their knees. The government they faced was no longer the shogunate of old. The Meiji government had spent the past decade building a modern army, equipped with the latest European weapons. They had French military advisors, Armstrong cannons, and thousands of troops trained in Western tactics. Against this formidable force, 37 men with swords might seem like a joke, but these samurai weren't laughing. Their plan was audacious, perhaps even insane. They would strike at the heart of government authority in their region, the Kumamoto Castle. This fortress had stood for centuries, witnessing countless battles and sieges. Now it would witness one more. But this time, it wouldn't be armies of samurai facing each other with matched weapons. This would be steel against gunpowder, tradition against modernity, the old Japan against the new. As they gathered in the pre-dawn darkness on that fateful morning, these 37 samurai knew they were about to make history. They had written their death poems, a centuries-old samurai tradition before going into battle. They had said goodbye to their families. They had made peace with their fate. But they had one last message to deliver to the government that had betrayed them, and they would write it in blood. The morning air was thick with tension as the 37 samurai made their final preparations. But what drove these proud warriors to such desperate measures? To understand their motivation, we need to look deeper into the crushing weight of change that had fallen upon them. In the years leading up to their rebellion, these men had watched their world crumble piece by piece. The Meiji government's reforms weren't just political, they were cultural genocide. Imagine if tomorrow, the United States government suddenly declared that all traditions dating before 1950 were now illegal. That's what these samurai faced. Take Yamamoto Tetsuo, one of the youngest among the 37. His father had been a respected sword instructor, teaching the ancient art of kenjutsu to hundreds of students. Now, those same dojos were being converted into Western-style military academies. The sacred training grounds where samurai had honed their skills for centuries were being transformed into rifle ranges. The sharp crack of gunfire had replaced the whisper of sword through air. But it wasn't just about the martial arts. The samurai were Japan's educated class, the scholars and administrators who had kept the country running for generations. Many of the 37 had served as government officials, teachers, and advisors. Now they were being replaced by young men fresh from Western-style universities, who spoke of democracy and capitalism with the same reverence the samurai had once reserved for Bushido, the way of the warrior. Their financial situation was equally desperate. When the government abolished the samurai stipends, they offered a one-time payment in government bonds as compensation. For many, these bonds were worth only a fraction of their former income. Imagine losing not just your job, but your entire profession, and being told to reinvent yourself in a world that no longer values your skills. The story of Katsura Kogoro, their leader, is particularly telling. Before the rebellion, he had tried to adapt to the new era. He had studied Western military tactics, learned about modern weapons, and even attempted to start a business. But watching his fellow samurai fall into poverty and despair, seeing their children go hungry while government officials grew rich on foreign trade, it was more than he could bear. The final straw came when the government began actively hunting down former samurai who showed any signs of dissent. Secret police, another Western import, began infiltrating traditional samurai gatherings. Former warriors were arrested for merely discussing the old ways. The very word samurai began to be used as an insult, synonymous with backward and primitive. In America, you might compare it to the treatment of Native American tribes in the 19th century. Proud warriors forced to abandon their way of life, their traditions criminalized, their children sent to schools designed to erase their culture. The parallels are striking, and just as tragic. As the 37 gathered in secret to plan their rebellion, they knew they were following in the footsteps of Saigo Takamori and the Satsuma Rebellion. But unlike Saigo, who had led thousands, they were just 37 men. Why would such a small group choose to fight against impossible odds? The answer lies in an ancient samurai tradition called junshi, the warrior's death. When a samurai lord died, his most loyal retainers would often commit ritual suicide to follow him into death. But these 37 weren't dying for a lord. They were dying for an idea. They were dying for the soul of old Japan. Their preparations were meticulous. Each man carried not just his sword, but also a small packet containing his final testament. These weren't just suicide notes. They were manifestos, carefully written explanations of why they chose to die this way. They wanted future generations to understand that they didn't fight because they thought they could win. They fought because not fighting meant accepting the death of everything they believed in. In the days before the rebellion, they moved in small groups, gathering supplies and intelligence. They knew the layout of Kumamoto Castle intimately. Many had served there in better days. They knew where the government stored its weapons, where the troops were quartered, where the weak points in the defense lay. But more importantly, they knew what their actions would mean. In a Japan racing to modernize, to prove itself the equal of Western powers, they would remind everyone of what was being lost in the mad rush forward. The attack began in the gray hours before dawn. 37 shadows moved silently through the streets of Kumamoto, their footsteps muffled by the morning mist. They had chosen their moment well. It was the changing of the guard, when the night watch would be tired and the morning watch not yet fully alert. The first sign that something was wrong came from a young police officer on his regular patrol. He spotted the group of men in traditional samurai garb, complete with the now illegal swords at their sides. But before he could raise the alarm, they were on him. The encounter was silent, swift, and deadly, a reminder that these men hadn't forgotten the skills that had made the samurai legendary. What happened next would be recorded in police reports, military documents, and local legends for generations to come. The 37 samurai split into 3 groups, each with a specific target. The first group, led by Katsura himself, headed for the castle's main armory. The second group targeted the barracks where the government troops were stationed. The third group, the smallest, but perhaps the most crucial, made for the telegraph office. They knew that if word of their attack reached Tokyo too quickly, they would be crushed before they could make their statement. The government forces were caught completely off guard. These weren't the disorganized riots they had come to expect from disgruntled former samurai. This was a military operation, planned with precision and executed with deadly efficiency. The samurai moved like ghosts through the modern fortifications, their ancient training proving devastatingly effective in close quarters. At the armory, Katsura's group encountered their first serious resistance. A dozen guards armed with modern rifles stood between them and their objective. What followed was a scene straight out of legend: samurai against riflemen, tradition against technology. The guards had the advantage of firearms, but in the pre-dawn darkness, in the confined space of the armory courtyard, those advantages were neutralized. Witnesses would later describe how the samurai seemed to flow like water around the bullets, closing the distance before the guards could reload their single-shot rifles. The clash of steel against steel lasted mere minutes, but it would be remembered for decades. The samurai suffered casualties. 3 of their number fell, but they achieved their objective. The armory was theirs. The second group, targeting the barracks, faced even fiercer resistance. The sound of fighting at the armory had alerted the soldiers, and they were ready. But ready for what? These weren't the rebels they had trained to fight. These were master swordsmen, experts in close-quarter combat, fighting in an environment they knew intimately. In a twist of irony, the very modernization that had doomed the samurai class now worked in their favor. The government troops, trained in Western-style warfare, were prepared for battles fought at a distance with rifles and artillery. They weren't prepared for warriors who could close that distance in seconds, who could turn corners and navigate corridors with lethal grace. The third group, meanwhile, had succeeded in their mission to cut off communications. They had disabled the telegraph lines and secured the office, but not before a partial message had been sent to Tokyo. The clock was now ticking. They had hours at most before reinforcements would arrive. By sunrise, the 37 had achieved what many had thought impossible. They had captured key positions within Kumamoto Castle. But this was just the beginning. They knew they couldn't hold these positions for long. That wasn't their objective. They were following an ancient samurai tradition of making a statement with death. As the morning sun illuminated the castle walls, the remaining samurai gathered in the central courtyard. They had lost 8 of their number in the initial assault, but they had also captured a significant cache of weapons and ammunition. More importantly, they had captured the attention of every Japanese citizen who still remembered the old ways. Katsura ordered his men to fortify their positions. They barricaded doors, set up defensive positions, and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. But first, they had one more task to complete. From the highest tower of Kumamoto Castle, they raised an ancient battle flag. Not the modern Japanese flag, but the traditional banner of the samurai clans. It was a direct challenge to the Meiji government, a declaration that the spirit of the samurai was not dead. The sight of that flag, snapping in the morning breeze above the modern military installation, sent shockwaves through the city. For the older citizens, it was a reminder of the Japan they had known. For the government officials, it was an intolerable insult. For the 29 remaining samurai, it was their death poem written across the sky. The government's response was swift and overwhelming. By mid-morning, the sound of military drums echoed through the streets of Kumamoto as nearly 2,000 imperial troops surrounded the castle. The modern Japanese army, trained by French military advisors and equipped with the latest Western weapons, was about to face off against 29 samurai armed with captured rifles and their ancestral swords. To understand the scale of this confrontation, imagine if a small group of Revolutionary War reenactors seized West Point, only to find themselves surrounded by the full might of the modern U.S. Army. The technological gap between the opposing forces was that dramatic. The government troops had artillery pieces that could reduce castle walls to rubble. They had Gatling guns, an early form of machine gun that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Against this firepower, the samurai had their skill, their courage, and the thick stone walls of Kumamoto Castle. Colonel Yamamoto Gonahayo, the commander of the government forces, was no stranger to dealing with samurai rebellions. He had fought in the Satsuma Rebellion and had seen firsthand how dangerous, desperate samurai could be. But even he was taken aback by the audacity of this attack. His first move was to establish communication with the rebels. Using a makeshift white flag, a government messenger approached the castle gates. The message was simple: surrender now, and the government would show mercy. The samurai's response was equally simple. From the castle walls, Katsura himself shouted down their answer: "We didn't come here to surrender. We came here to remind Japan of what it's losing." What followed was a masterclass in defensive warfare. The samurai, despite their small numbers, used every trick and technique from centuries of castle defense. They had positioned their captured rifles at key points, making any direct assault costly. They used the castle's complex architecture, its multiple baileys, curved walls, and numerous gates, to create killing zones where any attacking force would be exposed to fire from multiple directions. But perhaps their most effective weapon was psychological. They began to sing ancient war songs that hadn't been heard in Japan for decades. The haunting melodies carried across the battlefield, reminding the government troops of their own grandfathers, many of whom had been samurai themselves. Some of the younger soldiers, hearing these songs for the first time, felt a connection to their cultural heritage that the Meiji government had tried to suppress. The first assault came at noon. Government troops, moving in textbook Western formation, advanced toward the outer gates. The samurai let them get close, too close. Then, using skills honed through generations of warfare, they demonstrated why the samurai had ruled Japan for 7 centuries. The combination of captured rifles and masterful swordsmanship proved devastating in the close quarters of the castle approaches. The government forces retreated, leaving behind a dozen dead and wounded. Colonel Yamamoto was furious, but also impressed. These weren't just rebels fighting out of desperation. These were trained warriors executing a carefully planned defense. He ordered his artillery to begin bombardment of the castle walls. The next few hours became a duel between modern firepower and ancient stone. Kumamoto Castle, built in the 1600s, had weathered countless sieges, but never anything like this. The Armstrong guns, imported from Britain, began to chip away at the centuries-old fortifications. Inside, the samurai moved constantly, shifting positions, conserving ammunition, treating their wounded. But they weren't just fighting, they were teaching. Each samurai took time to write in small notebooks they carried, documenting their thoughts, their techniques, their reasons for fighting. They knew they wouldn't survive this battle, but they wanted future generations to understand what it truly meant to be samurai. As the afternoon wore on, the government forces settled into a siege pattern. They had the manpower and resources to wait out the rebels, but Colonel Yamamoto knew that wasn't an option. The longer this standoff continued, the more it would inspire other former samurai across Japan. This rebellion had to be crushed quickly and decisively. Inside the castle, the samurai were facing their own challenges. They had limited food and water, and more critically, their captured ammunition was running low. But their spirit remained unbroken. During a brief lull in the bombardment, one of the younger samurai asked Katsura if they had made a mistake, if their actions would only speed up the destruction of the samurai way of life. Katsura's response would later be recorded in one of the surviving notebooks. "We are not here to preserve our lives, but to preserve our honor." In the years to come, when people speak of the samurai, they will remember that even at the end, we remained true to our principles. Sometimes the most powerful victory is choosing how you lose. As the sun began to set on that fateful day, both sides knew the final act of this drama was approaching. The government forces had been reinforced. Nearly 3,000 troops now surrounded the castle, along with additional artillery pieces. Inside, the remaining samurai, now down to 23 men, prepared for their final stand. The scene was apocalyptic. The once proud walls of Kumamoto Castle were scarred by artillery fire, centuries-old stone blackened by explosive shells. Smoke from the bombardment mixed with the evening mist, creating an otherworldly atmosphere. It was as if the very gates between ancient and modern Japan had been torn open. Colonel Yamamoto had received new orders from Tokyo: end this rebellion before nightfall at any cost. The government feared that if these samurai held out until morning, their act of defiance might inspire similar uprisings across Japan. They had already received reports of former samurai in other provinces gathering, watching, waiting to see what would happen. Inside the castle, Katsura gathered his remaining men in what had once been the castle's main audience hall. The room, with its elegant wooden panels and painted screens, had witnessed countless ceremonies and political meetings over the centuries. Now it would witness one final samurai council. "We have shown them that the spirit of Bushido still lives," Katsura told his men. "Now we must show them how samurai die." Each warrior knew what this meant. They had all followed the news of the Satsuma Rebellion, where Saigo Takamori and his men had died charging modern artillery with their swords. But this would be different. They weren't going to throw their lives away in a futile charge. They had one final message to deliver. As the government forces prepared for their final assault, something unexpected happened. The sound of traditional court music began floating down from the castle towers. The samurai had found the castle's collection of ancient instruments, flutes, drums, and stringed instruments that had been used in formal ceremonies for centuries. They began performing a piece traditionally played during imperial ceremonies, a haunting melody that spoke of glory, honor, and the passing of ages. The effect on the government troops was profound. Many of these soldiers came from samurai families themselves, and this music was part of their heritage. Some were seen wiping tears from their eyes. Even Colonel Yamamoto, hardened by years of fighting rebel samurai, felt the weight of what was being lost. But orders were orders. As the music continued to play, the artillery opened up with everything they had. The bombardment was unprecedented. Later reports would indicate that more ammunition was expended in those final hours than during the entire Satsuma Rebellion. The castle walls, which had stood for hundreds of years, began to crumble. Yet still the music played. The samurai had positioned themselves strategically throughout the castle. They weren't trying to survive now. They were trying to make their final moments count. As government troops breached the outer defenses, they found themselves facing warriors who had achieved a state of perfect clarity. These weren't men fighting for victory anymore. They were living embodiments of their ancient code. The battle that followed would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary in Japanese history. The samurai, down to their last bullets, and with only their swords remaining, fought with a skill and determination that seemed superhuman. Each warrior had chosen their ground carefully, making their final stand in locations that held symbolic significance. Some defended the castle's ancestral shrines, others its historical documents and artifacts. Katsura himself took position in the highest tower, next to the ancient war banner they had raised that morning. Each man fought not just with his weapons, but with the accumulated wisdom and tradition of 7 centuries of samurai culture. The government troops, despite their overwhelming numbers and firepower, found themselves paying a heavy price for each step they took into the castle. The close quarters negated much of their technological advantage, and the samurai's superior swordsmanship proved devastating in the narrow corridors and staircases. As night fell, the music finally stopped. The last notes of the ancient melody faded away, replaced by the sounds of steel on steel, the crack of rifles, and the thunder of artillery. The castle that had stood as a symbol of feudal power for centuries was being destroyed room by room, corridor by corridor. In his final recorded words, found in a notebook recovered after the battle, Katsura wrote, "We die not for ourselves but for an idea. In an age that worships progress, we remind them that some things are worth preserving. Our defeat will speak louder than any victory." By midnight, the battle was drawing to its inevitable close. The once mighty Kumamoto Castle, which had witnessed centuries of Japanese history, was now a burning shell of its former self. The final moments of the rebellion would become the stuff of legend, passed down through generations in whispered tales and secret diaries. The last 12 samurai, including Katsura, had retreated to the castle's highest tower. They had spent their final bullets and were now armed only with their ancestral swords. The government forces, having learned respect for their opponents the hard way, approached cautiously, even now. What happened next was recorded in multiple accounts, though the details vary. What's clear is that the samurai did not wait to be cornered. Instead, they launched one final, coordinated attack. But this wasn't a mindless charge. It was a carefully choreographed demonstration of everything the samurai arts represented. Moving in perfect unison, they burst from the tower's various exits simultaneously. Each warrior had chosen a specific target, not for military advantage, but for symbolic significance. Some headed for the castle's historical archives, ensuring that important documents would survive. Others made for the shrine areas, protecting cultural treasures until their last breath. Katsura himself, wounded but unbowed, drove straight for the government commander's position. In a moment that would be immortalized in both official reports and local legends, he came face to face with Colonel Yamamoto, the old and new Japan standing just feet apart. Witnesses would later describe how time seemed to stop as these two men, both patriots, both warriors, but fighting for very different visions of their country, regarded each other. Katsura spoke his final words, "Remember us." Then he raised his sword in the traditional salute of a samurai master. The government troops, trained in modern warfare, had been taught that the age of sword fighting was over. Katsura and his final charge proved that spirit and skill could still overcome technology, if only for a moment. He cut through the colonel's guard detail with movements that seemed to defy human limitations, his sword describing patterns that had been perfected over centuries of martial arts evolution. In the end, it was a single rifle shot that stopped him, just steps away from Colonel Yamamoto. The last samurai fell, but he fell forward, his sword still pointing at the heart of the new Japan that had replaced his world. By dawn, it was over. The government forces had complete control of the castle, but their victory felt hollow. They had lost over 100 men, taking down just 37 samurai. More importantly, they had witnessed something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The end of an era, not with a whimper, but with a roar. The aftermath of the rebellion would prove more significant than anyone expected. The government, hoping to prevent the samurai from becoming martyrs, tried to suppress news of the battle. But soldiers talk, and the story spread. The tale of 37 men who had held off an entire modern army, even for just a day, became a symbol of resistance to blind modernization. Today, the ruins of Kumamoto Castle still stand, restored, but bearing the scars of that fateful battle. The site has become a pilgrimage destination for those seeking to understand Japan's complex journey into the modern world. Visitors can still see the marks of artillery fire on the ancient stones, touching history with their own hands. The samurai may be gone, but their spirit lives on in modern Japan. You can see it in the dedication of master craftsmen who spend decades perfecting their skills, in the martial artists who still practice the ancient forms, and in the business people who apply Bushido principles to corporate leadership. The 37 samurai of Kumamoto didn't fail. They planted seeds that would grow in ways they could never have imagined. As we reflect on their story, we might ask ourselves, what traditions and principles in our own cultures are worth preserving? What would we be willing to fight for, even against impossible odds? The answers may be different for each of us, but the questions themselves are part of the precious legacy left behind by 37 brave men who dared to challenge an empire. Thank you for watching this epic tale of courage, honor, and sacrifice. If you enjoyed this exploration of Japanese history, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from Japan's past. And remember, sometimes the most powerful victories come not in winning, but in how we choose to face defeat.